Hi folks, and welcome to the Cloud Foundry Foundation Virtual Summit. My name is Craig McLuckie, and I'm excited to have a few minutes to chat to you about a topic that I'm very passionate about, which is really the intersection of the world of developer technologies and infrastructure technologies. Before I jump in, I did want to say I hope that you and your loved ones are safe and well in this most trying of times. Obviously, as a community, we're working through an incredibly disruptive moment, both at the societal level, but also at the industry level. I'm personally not qualified to comment on the challenges we face societally, but I do stand in solidarity with those struggling for racial equality and justice in the world. And personally in support of businesses, large and small, that are working to adjust to the new reality that is emerging as a result of the unprecedented global pandemic we all face. It is almost impossible to predict what the world is going to look like in the coming years. But one thing is clear. The world is changing, businesses are changing, society is changing in some profound ways. When we look back historically, technology has been a catalyst for change itself. A new technology emerges. It creates new efficiencies for business. It creates new ways that businesses can create value for customers. And in many ways, technology disruption has fueled innovation in many ecosystems, looking back through history from the industrial era. But this does feel a little bit different. Change is being inflicted on us. Enterprise organizations are being forced by changes that are happening to engage their customers in new ways. The rate of change is propelling us at an unprecedented level. And when I think about what is going to ultimately differentiate organizations that are able to navigate the changes that we face right now, as businesses are having to operate in profoundly different ways, I keep coming back to the developer as being a catalyst for future success. How effectively enterprises can bring developers' capabilities to bear to drive the changes that they need to support their customers in this increasingly complex and evolving ecosystem will fundamentally define their ability to continue to compete and prosper in this changing ecosystem. And from my perspective, I've obviously been involved in this technology for some time. As one of the founders of the Kubernetes project, I participated in bringing a new infrastructure abstraction to market. Increasingly, my work in VMware, as we work to bring the Pivotal and VMware teams together, is giving me an opportunity to look at the world through a new lens, which I think is incredibly powerful and entirely relevant to this community. And as a starting point for this discussion, I'd really like to focus on what I perceive to be some of the emerging tensions that exist in enterprises at large. And this is a tension that is borne out over the last many years, and if anything is being accelerated by the world that we're moving into, which is the tension between the teams that are chartered with delivering infrastructure outcomes for organizations, the teams that are chartered with constructing platforms for general developer consumption, and then the development teams themselves that represent the interests of line of business, those organizations that are ultimately chartered with capturing business problems and solving them with code, whether that's code that they're writing themselves or whether it's code that's being integrated from third parties. And we do see this tremendous tension emerging. A line of businesses are being driven to operate at an unprecedented pace. This was true before a lot of the challenges we've been dealing with incidents like COVID took over. But if anything, that need is accelerated. And to serve those customers better, the infrastructure and platform teams are left scrambling. And I always say this, agile teams need agile infrastructure. And as we see those tensions starting to pull apart, there's an absolute need to bring technologies like Cloud Foundry into the mix, because I think it elegantly spans those gaps. And by harmonizing technologies like Cloud Foundry with the emerging infrastructure abstractions like Kubernetes, I think will create disproportionately positive outcomes for organizations large and small. Now, looking a little deeper into what's happening out there, one of the things that always fascinates me as I work with line of business teams is the separation of effort. How much of their time is spent engineering, that is dealing with the ooky mechanics of getting code into a production environment, versus developing, that is actually solving business problems with code, capturing business logic in code. And today, for most organizations, there's this disproportionate amount of emphasis on engineering. Often 80% of time that is taken on a day-to-day basis by large teams is spent worrying about the mechanics of setting up their environments, of dealing with DevOps practices, of reasoning about debugging a lot of instances out there, versus actually driving the innovation that organizations need. And our mission, hopefully as a community, but certainly as I look at my team's participation in this ecosystem, is to really skew the emphasis towards developing. Construct a set of experiences that enable enterprises to get their code into production in the most efficient way possible. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I've been working on technologies like Kubernetes as being an important part, a staple. And I think Kubernetes is doing a great job of normalizing infrastructure. I think the reason that it achieved such high levels of popularity was because finally we had the promise of a technology that would make every cloud environment, every on-premises environment, and potentially every edge environment look and feel consistent. That increased high levels of fungibility. It provided consistent operating semantics for those environments. And for that reason, we've seen pretty much every major enterprise out there start to embrace the technology and look at it as a common staple in their ecosystem. But the thing that I see happening out there almost on a daily basis is the challenge to answer the question, well, what happens next? And too often I see organizations get extremely excited about technologies like Kubernetes, put an inordinate amount of emphasis and effort into getting an operationally viable, robust deployment of a technology like Kubernetes deployed, but then finding themselves unable to actually deal with what happens next. How do we get production workloads into that environment? How do we set it up in a way that our developers are not spending an inordinate amount of their time constructing their own delivery mechanics to get applications out into that world? And that is where I see the power of the Cloud Foundry technology base. It's absolutely fascinating to see how conversations have changed. The conversations I'd have when I was purely representing the world of Kubernetes were certainly interesting, but it was more about bits and bytes and speeds and feeds and operationalization and SRE and that type of problem. But increasingly, the type of conversation that I have with organizations that have been consuming technologies like Cloud Foundry is really about that developer experience, the productivity, the thing that really matters to organizations. And I think the amazing opportunity we have as a community is to really bring these two worlds together, to look at technologies like Kubernetes as a way to normalize the playing field, to reduce the complexity of deploying a very broad cross-section of workloads into an infrastructure environment. And then technologies like Cloud Foundry emerging as a way to really light up those environments, to solve the problems that every developer has every day. How do I ultimately get my application into a production environment? And so when I think about Cloud Foundry, I always like to describe the CF push experience as this highway from a developer's IDE into a production environment. And it's amazing how by introducing a set of normalized constraints, by saying if something fits within this 12-factor format, if you use these libraries that are being delivered, whether that's in the Spring or .NET or pick the language runtime supported, you get an incredibly positive outcome. Your developers no longer have to worry so much about the mechanics of engineering. They just spend their time coding. And that inner development loop and outer development loop becomes a lot easier to deal with. Now, how do we bring that into the world of Kubernetes? And this is one of the things that I've been so excited to see is the focus on bringing Kubernetes as a natural orchestration technology to Cloud Foundry, and ultimately bringing the super highway experience to be able to go from a developer's desktop into that production context in as efficient a way possible. Now, I do think that the highway analogy is a little bit simplistic. When I think about the places that Cloud Foundry has been tremendously successful, it's relatively constrained to a certain set of patterns and practices. But when I think about the wide world of developer applications, there's obviously the need to start thinking about a much richer and broader set of patterns and practices. How do we start to think about, one, leveraging out the existing assets that enterprises have and bringing them onto this highway? Perhaps you're already building something using Jenkins. is there a way to use the processes that you have from a continuous integration perspective to deliver into this environment? So you can have systematized CD, you can bring all these things together. And so as I look at where we can have an opportunity to go, and certainly as I look at the direction that my team is pushing to bring Cloud Foundry forwards, we do see this pragmatism, looking at the world not necessarily as a superhighway, but as having a set of natural interchanges, more like a subway map, where you can continue that very efficient direct path to production. But you have the opportunities to look more broadly and bring in a much wider array of workloads into a consistent operating model, onto a consistent infrastructure base, and out to consistent environments that your developers no longer have to really worry about. And so I think the promise of the future for Cloud Foundry in particular is really cut around three things. I spent a lot of time talking to the team about what it takes to genericize the experience, to start to think about what we can do from the Cloud Foundry perspective to offer up capabilities to a much wider array of workloads. Polyglot environments, new classes of workloads like ML and AI, etc., are incredibly interesting. And for us to be able to do that, I believe that modularization is a very logical next step. To make the technology as applicable to as broader array of workloads as possible, it makes sense to start teasing apart some of the capabilities. And if I look at the work that's been done around KPAC and bringing that Cloud Foundry build pack model to a community and to a lot of technologies in a much more discrete, composable way, is incredibly powerful. And also think about the world of democratization. How do we make it so that this technology that historically has been quite intricate and complicated from an operations perspective is simply a lot easier to deploy, operate, and consume? How do we make it so that every Kubernetes cluster out there, and there's an increasingly large number of them, becomes a natural destination for workloads that can be built using the Cloud Foundry ideals? And this mission of genericization, modularization, ultimately democratization of the technologies will, I think, serve us well. It allows us to bring a very sharp focus to the needs of day-to-day developers as they're reasoning about this incredibly complex world. And it creates an amazing opportunity for us to take a positive step forwards and bring together two of the most robust and healthy open source communities out there. So with that, I wanted to thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Again, please stay safe and sane during this incredibly trying time. And I'm so looking forward to working with this community in the coming days, months, and years. Thank you.